I think China's nuclear buildup could be driven by paranoia rather than an expansionist objective, at least from the Chinese self-perception.
That's the voice of Tong Zhao. Tong Zhao is a senior fellow in Carnegie's nuclear policy program based at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. He's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here are your co-hosts, Tom Collina and Michelle Dover.
Welcome back to Press the Button. That was the voice of Jacqueline Xing, our new communications and marketing specialist, who is helping us produce Press the Button, and welcome to Plowshares, Jacqueline. Michelle, how are you? Great to see you. How was your weekend?
My weekend was lovely, full of fall colors and almost winter weather. We have a Christmas tree coming soon, so that's exciting. How about you?
Thanks. It was very nice. Our kids are starting to return for Thanksgiving, which is really exciting. Rake some leaves in the backyard, so the weather is very fall appropriate. So all is well. Looking forward to the holiday coming up this week. On the news update front, a few things that we should mention for our listeners. Friday was the 36th anniversary of the Geneva Summit of 1985. When Presidents Reagan and Gorbachev first declared that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought, which turned out to be a very important statement in ending the Cold War. The United States and Russia have repeated this declaration, in fact, earlier this year, and Russia and China have said a similar thing to each other. But so far, there's no U.S.-China joint declaration, and as we'll hear later in the show, that will be a useful thing to do to reduce tensions. Next, U.S.-Iran talks on the nuclear deal resume on Monday, but things are not looking so good. Iran is asking for things that the Biden administration seemingly cannot deliver, such as a guarantee that the deal would be upheld by future administrations. Media reports say the Biden team is exploring an interim deal to freeze Iran's nuclear program while the talks continue, another sign that there'll be no quick breakthroughs next week. And lastly, International Atomic Energy Agency Secretary General Rafael Grossi is in Iran right now to try to revive monitoring and inspection before the agency's Board of Governors meets this week. And Michelle, what do you have for us on Early Warning?
Today on Early Warning, we are discussing Russia's recent test of an anti-satellite missile and why there haven't been any bans on these tests yet and what the prospects are for the future.
And after that, I sit down with Tong Zhao. He's a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We discuss last week's virtual summit between Presidents Biden and Xi and what we should expect for U.S.-China nuclear relations going forward. Tong Zhao has fascinating insights into what may be motivating China's nuclear expansion, so please stay tuned.
And if you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Your feedback helps us improve the show. And for all those Americans out there, happy Thanksgiving. With that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Del. Today I'm joined by Polina Sinovets, head of the Odessa Center for Nonproliferation, and Anuradha Damale, part of the verification and monitoring team at VERTIC, which is the Verification Research, Training, and Information Center. Thank you both for joining.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting.
As you know, we have 7 minutes to cover the week's nuclear and national security news. 7 minutes is the amount of time a U.S. president would have to decide whether to respond to an incoming nuclear attack. So if they can make the decision in 7 minutes, then we can do the news, right?
Absolutely.
Starting now. Anu, last week, Russia tested a direct descent anti-satellite missile, which struck a defunct Russian satellite and created a debris field in low Earth orbit of more than 1,500 pieces of trackable debris. Why is this test such a big event?
So I'm going to call it an ASAT test just for ease of explanation. An ASAT test is basically a country's chance to show their capability in outer space and show that they have the ability to target a satellite and destroy it. And there are only a handful of countries that have done ASAT tests and have the capacity and have demonstrated it, and Russia is one of them. A few years ago, India did a similar test that was met with, I would say, a similar amount of backlash. But the issue with the Russian test in particular is how much debris was generated, and the fact, and this is kind of the headline, that it endangered the International Space Station and the people on it. So, Russian people, United States people, people from everyone that works at the ISS. And not only that, but we don't have a full picture of where this debris is and where it's going to go yet. And the reason why that's a problem is because in outer space, a small chunk of metal hurtling towards something that is critical to a state's national infrastructure is a security and safety threat to that thing. Now, militarily, yes, we've seen ASAT tests happen. Within the past year, the United States re-announced a capability of an advanced, quote unquote, ASAT weapon. However, to actually do it and to generate this debris crosses over in that gray space between safety and security. And at a time where the open-ended working group on responsibility in outer space has only just begun a few weeks ago, for this kind of thing to happen is incredibly irresponsible, especially from a state that has been pushing forward on a treaty to prevent the use and placement of arms in outer space.
Polina, given all the risk, including, as Anu was saying, to Russia's own cosmonauts aboard the International Space Station, why would Russia conduct such a test?
I don't think that Russians put their cosmonauts under threat intentionally. Probably Roscosmos just didn't think of them ahead of time. Actually, in Russian strategic culture, the interests of humans has always been limited with the interests of state, and they were always subdued to it. For example, during the Second World War, when Russians were demining fields, they were sending infantry on the minefields to track mines with the price of their lives. Then the sappers came, and then the expensive military equipment was followed that. Of course, in this situation, the Assad case was not so outrageous. However, it keeps the same situation of probably disregarding human security when it comes to the higher state interests. I don't think that somebody wanted to put cosmonauts under threat, but the cosmonauts were just not a priority in the situation. Probably also the Assad test was not only the case of testing the military capability, but it also was the political maneuver where Russia had wider interests, such as diverting attention from the recent migration crisis at the Polish-Belarusian border and the new escalation of Russian troops at the border with Ukraine. The safety and security of the cosmonauts was not the priority. That's what I wanted to say. So they were just not thinking of them.
So for both of you, why haven't we seen a ban on ASAT tests? And do you think this will prompt negotiations to adopt one? Anu, let's start with you.
Sure. So I think, and this is a very base level argument, but there has been a long-standing debate around the definition of a weapon in outer space. And what the ASAT tests generate, for instance, the debris, defining them as a weapon is something that comes under a lot of contention. There's also issues to do with verification, attribution, and monitoring. And there has been a push and pull in the international community on setting up regulations and hardcore policy surrounding the use of weapons and militarization of outer space because of these definitional verification, monitoring, and so on issues. I also think that the use of outer space as a domain, quote unquote, is sometimes to try and push and pull ground level political debate. And so you see it tying in with arms control disagreements and generic international agreements as well. And so in order to actually move forward, there needs to be this understanding that actually space security is so much more than just the military issues. It's what Polina said. You have to start prioritizing human security, safety, and how this connects to a greater economy. That for me is sort of a base level argument.
I very much agree. But I also think that there are two not reasons, but probably interconnected domains. First of all, of course, it's very much, obvious that after the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which prevented states from deploying weapons of mass destruction in space, there has never been consensus among the space nations on what should be permitted under the new treaty and what not. For many years, the UN Disarmament Conference in Geneva failed to produce the Treaty on Prevention of the Arms Race. Again, there were the ideas of Russia and China on the Treaty of Prevention of the Arms Race in space, but it met with the US objections because of the lack of verification and the failure to include the ground-launched S-8 weapons. Again, both US, Russia, and China ignored the EU Code of Conduct in Outer Space, which put forward the ban on destroying or damaging satellites. And maybe the main reason is that it's not within the interests of the states to adopt the new treaty. Because, for example, if we take a single state such as Russia, we'll see that it's quite profitable for Russia to develop the S-8 capabilities. For example, of course, it contributes to reconnaissance, it's neutralizing early warning satellites, and in general, it presents the asymmetric response for the US missile defense project, which Russia is so much afraid of. Also, for Russia, it's quite profitable because they consider that the dependence of the United States on the satellites is a military weakness. Most of today missile defenses Russia is deploying, they are focused on neutralizing the US satellites. For example, such systems as S-400, S-500 are ASAT capable. So what I mean here is that today the ASAT ban is hardly possible because the development of ASAT capabilities, it corresponds to interests of the leading space nations. So it's really hard to find a common ground for the treaty.
An additional reason I think that ASATs haven't been banned as a concept is because ASATs aren't just ground-based. Sometimes they can come from something called a rendezvous proximity operation. And these servicing operations can be dual use. And so to police the use and guess the use often of these operations would be required in order to ban ASATs in the first instance, creating more and more levels of regulation and verification within those processes.
Well, Polina, Anu, I'm afraid our time is up. Thank you so much for covering such a complicated issue in such a short amount of time.
Thank you for inviting.
Thank you for having us.
Hi, I'm Bonnie Fisk, Deputy Director of Development at Plowshares Fund and a Press the Button listener. When I first joined Plowshares Fund back in 2018, I didn't know anything about nuclear weapons. I came here with just the motivation to help create a safer world and a commitment to lifelong learning. My colleagues told me they'd teach me everything I need to know, and did they ever? Still do, actually. As I continue to grow ever more committed to Plowshares Fund and the reduction and elimination of nuclear weapons, I found that I rely on Press the Button so much. It's a resource for the latest analysis and a place where I can drop in fully, without distractions, and gain new insight into this issue I've come to know and love. I find inspiration from the weekly guests and our partners, and I know I'm a better contributor to our cause just by tuning in. Please consider supporting Plowshares Fund and helping make Press the Button possible by making a donation today. Or make it a holiday gift and send one of our festive e-cards to someone in your life who is also passionate about the pursuit of a safe and secure future. Visit plowshares.org/donate today. And thanks for listening.
Last week, the United States and China held a virtual summit where Presidents Biden and Xi agreed to explore talks on strategic stability, a possible step to future arms control discussions. So, to be clear, this process is still tentative and undefined, but it could lead to a breakthrough in managing growing nuclear tensions in the US-China relationship. The temperature has been rising since China was discovered earlier this year to be building hundreds of silos, presumably for nuclear-armed missiles, and it recently tested a hypersonic weapon. The Pentagon estimates that China's nuclear expansion could enable it to have up to 1,000 warheads by 2030, or about 3 times more than it currently has. And just for context, the United States and Russia each have about 4,000 warheads. To help us understand how important this potential breakthrough on U.S.-China talks might be and where they might be going, we are joined by Tong Zhao. He is a senior fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He is based in Beijing, and he is the author of a recent New York Times op-ed titled, "Why is China Building Up Its Nuclear Arsenal?" Tong, it's really, really great to have you here, and I want to thank you joining for what is such a late hour in Beijing.
Well, thank you, Tom, for having me. It's such an honor and pleasure to join the program.
Let's jump in. Let's start with the summit last week. I think many of us were surprised that the strategic stability talks came up. They weren't initially announced as an output of the summit, but were only talked about the next day by Jake Sullivan at an event at Brookings. Give us your sense of what they agreed to and how significant this is.
I think it's important we don't read too much into this and get ahead of ourselves. Basically, I think it's the US pushing the subject. The two leaders agreed to begin to carry forward a discussion on strategic stability issues, which sounds to me as maybe China just responded to the US proposal with a general agreement about the importance of the issue. There may not be any concrete commitments to do any specific things after the summit. And, the Chinese readout of the summit did not include this point of starting a talk on strategic stability. And when the spokesperson of the Chinese Foreign Ministry was asked about this question, he also said he has no information to offer. And if we look at the Chinese nuclear development, as recent as March this year, the Chinese President Xi just announced during the 2 sessions in March that China will accelerate the construction of high-level strategic deterrent systems, which means China may still be at the early stage of a years-long nuclear modernization program. I think there's a tension between the Chinese plan for its future nuclear expansion and the US pressure for China to join arms control or strategic stability discussion. We should, I think, have realistic expectations.
Thank you for that helpful reality check to what we're seeing as maybe over exuberance here on the US side for where this might be going. But if there were to be follow-up talks to this, what do you think, given what you said about China being committed to its program, what do you think China might be interested in talking about in this space if they were to have follow-on talks?
Well, at this point, given the lack of official discussion on these issues, any talk on any subject relevant to nuclear would help build better mutual understanding and help stabilize the nuclear equation between the two sides. I think, when we talk about strategic stability, the Chinese traditional understanding of the term is much broader than the traditional understanding in the Western countries. In the Chinese term, strategic stability includes many things more than nuclear. It illustrates the overall status of bilateral relationship. And I think it might be useful to have a broader strategic stability discussion beyond the nuclear issue, because currently the US-China relationship faces a fundamental predicament, which is the American efforts to uphold its basic values like human rights and democracy is viewed by China as posing the gravest threat to China's regime security, to China's core national interests. And that generates the highest level of Chinese threat perception, and that directly fuels into China's nuclear modernization. So we need to talk about these fundamental challenges in bilateral relationship. In addition to that broader but very important political talk, I think it would be good to also have a dedicated nuclear dialogue. Maybe something like the US-Russian bilateral strategic stability dialogue that includes everything that might affect the nuclear equation, missile defense, conventional precision strike weapons, space-based system, even cyber. We need to have that comprehensive understanding of the nuclear equation to help stabilize the relationship. And in addition to that, all these proposals are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but if the very broad nuclear dialogue is not going to yield any concrete result in the near term, then I think it wouldn't hurt to also start some specific discussions around concrete issues like risk reduction, or the entanglement between nuclear and conventional systems, or to have a working group to look at the implication of launch on warning posture. China is also potentially shifting towards launch on warning. There may be useful to set up a working group to focus on capacity building, to introduce Chinese weapon inspections to the US-Russian bilateral verification regime to help familiarize Chinese experts about how arms control inspection and verification is conducted. So it would be good to have specific working groups or joint studies around concrete issues if we want to have near-term results.
Thanks for that. Now, let's talk a little bit about how we got here. The Biden administration, I think, like everyone else, is trying to understand what China is doing with its nuclear forces, what its thinking is. Give us your thoughts on that.
Well, I think if we look at what China is doing, it's really comprehensive modernization. It's not necessarily driven by any one specific US weapon system or US threat. Of course, China is doing a lot of things to counter American missile defense, including the recently reported testing of an orbital hypersonic weapon system. But China is also reportedly building a lot of ICBM silos. Those are not ideal for addressing missile defense threat. Those reflect Chinese concern about American preemptive nuclear first strike. And we also see China building or expanding its nuclear submarine force. A recent American projection is China might have up to 8 nuclear subs by the end of this decade, which means China can also reach the American or Russian level of nuclear subs in the foreseeable future. And China is adding an air leg to its nuclear triad. There is no apparent reason why China is doing that, what necessary value would be added by having that air-based nuclear system. My understanding is after the current Chinese paramount leader came into power in 2012, he has a different understanding for China's future. He wants to achieve a national rejuvenation for China. He believes that for China to become a strong country, it needs a strong military. That is written into the recently reported new historical resolution passed at the six-party plenum. It also says, China needs a military that is commensurate to China's international status. So I think that reflects this broader belief of this Chinese paramount leader that if China wants to be a great power, it needs to have a great military, a world-class military. And that means China's inferior nuclear capability is a problem, and China needs to fill that gap. And that, I think, is further influenced by what is happening recently in geopolitics. The US-China rivalry and competition is really raising China's threat perception. As I said, the US efforts to push China on issues of human rights, democracy, rule of law are viewed by China as US efforts to destabilize the Chinese system, to delegitimize the Chinese government, and to forcibly disrupt China's peaceful rise. And that threat perception, I think, feeds to a greater incentive to accelerate this nuclear build-up process. At the technical level, when you have the political leader give you the green light for expand your military, your nuclear power, I think people naturally want to explore more sophisticated nuclear strategy. I think it's natural for China to want to have nuclear escalation management capability in addition to a basic secure second strike capability and massive retaliation strategy. So if China now wants to pursue escalation management capacity, that I think will make it much harder for the two sides to contain their nuclear competition. But I think there are indications that China might be pursuing that type of capability.
So given all that, you can see the problem with perception management here, where many in Washington look at what China is doing and see a threat and see a move towards dominance in some way that the United States has to respond to. Do you see what China is doing as posing a direct threat to the United States that the United States has to respond to? Or, pointing to your great op-ed in the New York Times, do you see this more as China trying to remind the United States that we're both vulnerable to each other?
I think from China's perspective, all it is doing is driven by a self-defensive objective. It sees the US as being more hostile against China due to the geopolitical reasons I just mentioned. It sees the US as being more willing to take greater risks to destabilize China. Therefore, it believes that there is a greater risk for China to threaten nuclear escalation in a future regional conflict with China. And that fear might actually have failed the Chinese incentive to build escalation management capability. In other words, I think China's nuclear buildup could be driven by paranoia rather than an expansionist objective, at least from the Chinese self-perception. In this sense, the key problem is the paranoia. And if US responds with more efforts to strengthen its nuclear power or explicitly pursue nuclear dominance, I think that will only further contribute to the Chinese paranoia, and it would further incentivize China to invest more into nuclear capabilities. So I don't see that as a good way out. I argued for the US to acknowledge the de facto existence of mutual vulnerability with China rather than accept mutual vulnerability with China. I think for US to simply acknowledge the de facto existence of mutual vulnerability could help mitigate the Chinese paranoia. But to accept it is much more complex. You need to address American allies' concern about China's conventional level military aggressiveness in the region. And we also don't know if what China expects to happen after the two sides agree to a mutual vulnerability relationship. Would China be assured simply by a rhetorical commitment from the United States to mutual vulnerability, or is China expecting the US to modify its military capabilities to make its mutual vulnerability commitment credible? It takes, I think, a much complex process for the two sides to figure out how they can actually agree to a mutual vulnerability relationship at the nuclear level, and how China can offer reassurance to the US, to its allies, to address their concerns about conventional level military issues. I think at least for now, acknowledging mutual vulnerability can help calm down China's paranoia, and then use a broader dialogue to understand how they can actually forge a more formal mutual vulnerability relationship.
And one step you've suggested towards that is, in your article, you noted the 1985 Reagan-Gorbachev joint statement that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. And you're suggesting that the United States and China agree to something similar. Would that be helpful then, in your view?
Yes, I think that that type of statement, that nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought, would indicate that the US is not seeking nuclear escalation to coerce China. Some Chinese experts sincerely believe that the US has a strategy to conduct war fighting. They want to pursue nuclear primacy over China. The US believe that nuclear war can be won, especially vis-a-vis a weaker party like China. So that type of statement could reduce this paranoia. again, it's hard to know how this statement by itself would be reassuring, how much reassuring the statement would be to China unless the two sides start talking and start to find out. Maybe China itself doesn't know how it wants to be reassured. And therefore, I think a talk would open up opportunity for China to conduct more internal deliberations. And I think the statement is simply the first step that could lead to a more constructive process of bilateral engagement.
Now, one thing that China has, as you well know, has had a long-term commitment to no first use, and for a long time has been asking the United States and the other nuclear powers to do the same. Would some sort of statement from the United States at this point be reassuring to China? Is it too late for that? What's your view on no first use?
I think China genuinely believes that no first use would indicate a less hostile U.S. intention, would make U.S. less capable to impose nuclear coercion on China. But again, I think the Chinese thinking on this issue is not clear and not necessarily well thought out. For example, if U.S. really adopts no first use, would that rhetorical commitment by itself reassure China? We have seen the Biden administration being more open to ideas like sole purpose or no first use, but the Chinese reaction to that is mixed. Many Chinese experts raise questions about why Biden administration wants to do a sole purpose. Is that a disguise of a more aggressive military plan? So I think China itself, may now know if a simple rhetorical commitment would be good enough. So it would be useful for the two sides to have a discussion about the specific implications of no first use. What's the Chinese expectation? Does China want the US to take concrete measures to modify its nuclear capability to make its no first use credible? We need talks to find out. And again, I don't think China itself has thought through what specific reassurance measures it wants from the United States in terms of no first use. And also, I think US has questions about the credibility of Chinese no first use. So they can discuss and try to agree on a common set of criteria or standards of what constitutes credible no first use. And I think that would lay a ground for a more constructive discussion on no first use.
Thank you. Very helpful. We're running out of time, but before we let you go, I really want to ask you one question that kind of zooms out, if you will, and expands the look here. I want to step back and look at the broader security situation, some of the issues you mentioned earlier in our talks. And the United States' commitment to Taiwan, of course, comes up a lot in the U.S.-China relationship. And Beijing's actions have grown more assertive toward Taiwan. And there's a lot of concern that the United States and China might go to war over Taiwan. So I wanted to ask you your views on, do you think there's a real risk of military conflict over Taiwan?
I think it's increasingly clear that the Chinese paramount leader, President Xi, is more ambitious than some of his predecessors. He wants to be a historical figure in Chinese history. And if you look at China's internal environment under his governance, he has promoted this idea that to achieve unification with Taiwan is China's internal matter. No one else has a say in this, and they shouldn't try to interfere. And that is coupled with the fact that China now has greater and greater military power to actually ensure that external powers like the United States wouldn't be able to intervene if China wants to achieve its national unification. So I think that is, increasing the tensions across Taiwan Strait. And internally, I think we have seen international analysts have pointed out that there is growing concentration of power in the Chinese decision-making system under the paramount leader in recent years. There are less checks and balances within the system. No one raise ideas that are against the personal view of the paramount leader. and people gradually understand that the paramount leader, has an ambition to achieve, national rejuvenation, and he thinks it is in Chinese right to do so. And therefore, under this environment, if people stand up and say, we should, think about it more carefully, maintaining status quo may be more important, I think they will be labeled as traitors. No one is really pushing back in the system, and it's only his view that matters at the end of the day. Everyone's guessing what is his plan for Taiwan. So I think this is what is really formidable in such an internal environment, coupled with the fact that China is growing military power to achieve its goal. So I think, yes, to answer your question, there is a growing risk of military conflict.
Tong Zhao, thank you so much. This has been a terrific conversation. We really appreciate your time today.
Sure, it's a great pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Lauren Billett and Angela Keller, and in San Francisco by Jacqueline Shing and Delphine Vigil, with research and assistance from Alex Hall, Harry Tarpey, and Desiree Cepetis. Audio engineering and sound design by Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.